Hi, I'm Helen Oakwater, and I want to talk to you about the impact of regulation and self-regulation skills on whether we should place siblings together or apart in adoption and long-term fostering. I want to start with looking at the autonomic nervous system and how we regulate ourselves. Ideally, we have a balance and coherent state where we can think and feel. However, we can go into a hyper-aroused state when we're stressed in the sympathetic nervous system, and that's where all we can do is fight, flight, because we are in fear. We cannot think. Stress mode. The opposite when we're in our parasympathetic nervous system is when we're under-aroused or hypo-aroused, and we can only feel, or possibly not feel, frozen, withdrawn, dissociated, again fear. This is the more depressed state. And in normal functioning, we spend most of our time here. Something happens, loud bang, fire alarm goes off, we go up into stressed mode, but then we have the skills to bring us back down into a state of being self-regulated. We have this window of tolerance, we're balanced. It might be that sometimes we drop down into the more depressed state with dysregulation in a more frozen and dissociated way. This place of regulation is where we want to live most of our lives. This is the place where we can think as well as feel. And thinking is what we need to do for learning, for education, for thought processing, and actually managing most of our lives. Fortunately, most of us have a fairly wide window of tolerance, but it's not like that for everyone, and I want us to think about how it is created. If you think of an infant, they need an adult around them to help them regulate. They start crying, they have no way of controlling themselves. So they need a parent to pick them up and go, it's all right, no, and help them bring themselves down. And they do that with soothing sounds and coherent breathing, calm breathing. And through those interactions, thousands and thousands of times, the infant starts learning how to regulate themselves. So they go from a very narrow window of tolerance, and as they become a toddler, it gets a little bit wider, and then a bit wider still as a child. Then it widens into adolescence, where it might do a bit of that, and then they get to an adult where ideally they've got a nice wide window of tolerance. So let's say the window of tolerance could be a 10 for maximum, and it's very narrow when it's a 1. And we can represent that with, I think, a diagram. And if you've got a person who's got a window of tolerance 7 to 9, reasonably wide, something happens, an external challenge, pressure, something that's a stressor, it can be taken in, processed calmly, and then there is a calm response because they've had the window of tolerance to regulate themselves in. That's not true for everyone. For some people, their window of tolerance is quite narrow. And so a stressor comes in and they might have one of two responses. They might have the big fight, flight, and they react in a big, may look angry, but in a big way to the same trigger that this person could handle. The other way that it might happen is that the trigger comes in from here, and for somebody who can go into a more dissociated state, they may not appear to have much of a reaction. It's not so obvious because it's actually, the reaction is happening on the inside where they may be dissociating, withdrawing, freezing, but on the outside, smile and nod, smile and nod. The thing that both of these have is that they are in a place of fear and they don't have the capacity to think. So what are the implications of this concept? There's quite a lot of them. Let's think of two people together, and let's say they've both got a fairly wide window of tolerance, and this person, when they get triggered, it might come out as a bit of a fight flight, but it doesn't come out in a really big way. And this person is a bit more dissociated. They tend to go into their parasympathetic nervous system, and so a bit more dissociated. But they've both got a fairly wide window of tolerance, so most of the time they can communicate pretty well. They are both actually in a calm state, coherent and balanced. So the interactions between these two work pretty well. Now let's think of two people who have both got a narrow window of tolerance. A stressor comes in to this one and they react big time. Big, angry, fight, flight. They respond very overtly. This person starts to dissociate, starts to withdraw, starts to become depressed. Maybe fake smile, smile and nod, smile with the mouth, not with the eyes, because they are feeling, or they are cutting themselves off from that feeling. So imagine what it is like in a relationship where you have one person whose tendency is to go out, fight, flight, and this person who's got a tendency to withdraw and maybe start to be depressed. Think of what that's going to look like from a behavioural point of view. And then just think for a moment, what might it be like living with people like that? What if they were your parents? Now, ideally, what we have with parents when they have a young child, so they have an infant that they're looking after, a baby, anyone who's had a baby knows that actually your window of tolerance when you're lacking sleep and when it's feeling quite stressful, it's not nice and round. It gets a bit frayed at the edges. And so there may be, it may get a bit harder, but most of the time this parent can actually respond in a pretty calm way to the child. Both of them responding fairly gently with the child. And so the child learns how to regulate themselves, and they're growing up in a calm environment. And so their window of tolerance over the years gets wider and wider and wider. They're able to go to school, sit in a classroom, listen, be and feel calm, so they can feel and think. Now, for some parents, it's not like that. They actually have a child who has a narrow window of tolerance, but it's not a baby, it's not an infant, it's a much older child. It's a child who maybe grew up with parents who were angry and or dissociated. So they grew up and did not learn how to enlarge their window of tolerance. So they have very poor self-regulation skills. And that is true for many children who become adopted or into long-term foster care, live with parents in a domestic violence environment. They may go off on one very quickly, or maybe in a fearful domestic violence environment, they will withdraw and they will become small and quiet, because that way they won't be seen and they won't be hurt. So what is it like parenting a child with narrow window of tolerance? It's difficult. And part of the skills, if you are parenting a child who's been traumatized, is that you have to remain calm and you have to continue therapeutic parenting with this child so that you can help them to self-regulate, and gradually their window of tolerance will enlarge. But to do that, this child has to feel that the environment around them is safe. And then slowly they can start learning how to feel safe in their own bodies. Because you don't feel safe in your own body when you are very highly dysregulated. So now let's think, what's it like if you are parenting two traumatized children? The frayed edges are going to happen even more. And what happens if one of these kids is a fight-flighter most of the time, because you can move between the two, most of the time, kicks off, gets angry, fights, shouts, becomes violent, out of fear. It's from a fear base. It's not with any intention to hurt. It's with an intention to stay protected and safe and try and find safety in a fearful environment. One is like that, and the other has learnt mainly to dissociate, to freeze, with most of the time, but can become a bit more dissociated and can also sometimes go into fight-flight. You'll see this, for example, with children who appear to behave very well in school, and then they come home and they absolutely lose it. They've kept themselves dissociated and in that frozen mode in school, and then when they've got home where they feel that little bit safer, then they can go into the sympathetic high stress response. So imagine what it's like for these parents having to manage these two different children and endeavour to keep their responses calm and coherent. And it may be that after a while they might get a bit challenged themselves and maybe start, this one tends to get a little bit depressed and this one tends to a bit more fight, flight and high stressing. Now let's imagine siblings. And if we have, let's say, these three siblings here, and one of them is often in a high fight-flight state. That's sibling number one. Sibling number two, actually, when around sibling number one, actually tends to get a bit frozen around sibling number two, around number one. But with number 3, actually, that's the time when their stress comes out. And sibling number 3, again, stress in certain directions, but also some freezing around here. And remember, the motivation for this is to try and feel safe. So how do you start assessing what the relationships are here for these 3 children? And then you've got a 4th child who people say, oh, she's so sweet. And actually, when you know how to look, you realise that this is a child that's frozen and that's really quite dissociated, not in touch with themselves at all, and is stuck very much in fear. And looking at how these 4 children interact, purely looking at it from a self-regulation point of view, what would be the right thing to do with these children? Do you separate them? Or do you keep them together? Are 2 parents going to be able to look after those 4 children and give each of them what they individually need? Added to which, it may be that these 4 children have different attachment styles. One may be disorganized, another ambivalent, anxious, avoidant. And each of those different attachment styles require different types of therapeutic reparenting. So if you've got 2 parents who are trying to parent 3, in this case, different children, what's happening here? You've actually got a system. These kids have together in their birth families worked out a way of operating. And so this one, maybe they're avoidant and they go off in that direction. This one here actually has got a disorganized pattern. So they go off, but also they do the freezing as well in certain situations. And this one has a tendency just to be frozen most of the time, but with occasional bits of stress as well. How can these 2 adults who started off with a window of tolerance out here, that over time managing these 3 and trying to parent them therapeutically, their own window of tolerance has shrunk. And this one has started to become a bit more angry and going out, but still able to do some calm. This one can do some calm as well, but when really, really pressured, this one goes into a bit of freezing and maybe some depression. Are we providing these children with a safe environment with these 2 parents? And these 2 parents started off with a very high open window of tolerance, but they have lived with traumatized children. They have lived with children who've been angry, possibly violent, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. What's the impact on these 2 parents? What level of support have these 5 people received? What is the impact on them, on these 3 children and these 2 adults? Have we provided an environment where each of these children can thrive and reach their potential? Or have we left them with a bond that's actually a traumatic bond? Do these children feel safe in their own bodies, in the environment in which they are living? And I would argue that actually providing children with an environment where they can reach their maximum potential is the most important thing, and where they can learn to regulate themselves, which requires adults who can also maintain that self-regulation over a long, long time. So that for me raises questions around the kids needing forensic assessments by experts who understand how to look at the regulation, how to look at the attachments between the individual children, and start thinking about what will happen over weeks, years, months, decades for those children. What sort of parents do they need, and is it asking too much of one set of parents to provide all of that for 2, 3, 4 children? Is that possible for 2, 3, 4 traumatised children, none of whom have good regulation skills, all of whom have narrow window of tolerances? Imagine what that's like when they are teenagers, when part of their prefrontal cortex goes offline anyway, and the challenges of teenagers magnified with this. These families need ongoing trauma-informed support for decades, and they need really good therapeutic parenting. If you want to know more on this, I've blogged about this and written. There are a lot of articles, videos, online training, lots of free resources at fabparents.co.uk. I'm Helen Oakwater. I'm the author of Bubble Wrap Children, so there's lots of places you can go to learn more, and you can contact me on Twitter or via Facebook and via Fab Parents. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have found it informative. Take good care.